Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Paul Buckle, and I have Keith Miller with me today as well.
Hello, everyone.
And we're going to be talking to you about heating oil tanks and real estate, an overview of risks and due diligence measures. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We're going to be recording this presentation, so if you're uncomfortable with that, please turn off your camera, and we remind everyone to mute themselves for the duration of the presentation. During the presentation, please feel free to use the chat box. We'll get to questions at the end, and there'll be a Q&A session, so if you don't want to type it out, you can also ask an audio question at the end if you just raise your hand using the raise your hand function. All right, let's dive in. Here is a brief overview of the topics for discussion today. I'm going to start with an overview of heating oil tanks in the CRD and some history. We're going to get into general remediation processes and what that looks like, the risks associated with tanks, and then get into some common misconceptions, due diligence measures that you can take, things to look for, and best practice methods for identifying them, evaluating your risks, and then we'll finish off with some key points and recommendations. This slide gives us an overview of when tanks were used and how many remain in the CRD. Heating oil was primarily used for fuel pre-1991, before natural gas came over to the island, and tanks were generally buried below ground prior to 1970. Although it's not a hard and fast deadline, it's a good place to start. Tanks above or generally moved above ground after 1970. There was an increased attention to the issue in 2013 when lenders, buyers, and insurance companies took more of an interest in this as more and more information came out in terms of the risks that were associated with these tanks. There are an unknown number of USTs abandoned without record in the CRD, and many omissions in municipal records. Just a table on the right here is showing us, as of 2011, the total number of households and that had heating oil systems and or tanks in them. So about 150,000 in 2011. And again, those are the registered ones. So any unknown tanks or non-registered tanks obviously aren't part of that number. So this is an underestimation. There are multiple stakeholders involved when it comes to underground tanks. The main one is obviously property owners. They will almost certainly incur costs for any sort of spills or removals related to tanks. There's also the previous owners, though, that can be found liable for damages, and Keith will expand on this a little bit on his section. The neighbors, so even if you don't have a tank on your site, your property can be impacted from neighboring properties, or vice versa, you can impact neighboring properties if your tank leaks. Real estate agents, so they're responsible for educating buyers and their sellers to the potential risks involved with tanks and whether those risks are acceptable. Insurance, so most homeowners have an insurance policy that it can include an environmental clause or have clauses that don't cover certain items. So Keith will dive more into this and explain what's typically covered and what's not when it comes to tanks and environmental issues. And finally, lenders. So usually lenders are requiring a report or some sort of sampling or at least due diligence method showing that there either wasn't a tank on site or if there was, that it's been taken care of adequately. And finally, local government. So if a spill is large enough, the provincial government will get involved and notified, or if the municipality gets notified, they can assist in terms of mitigating the spill and help the initial response, I guess, in terms of cleanup before consultants get involved. So as I mentioned, this is the typical remediation process. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see a flow chart. So if a UST gets identified on site or suspected on site through the due diligence period, that kind of brings us involved in some more investigations. So that's that first arrow there. On the right, we have the heating oil spill. So if a spill is identified, it often gets reported to the municipality if there's maybe a sheen in a creek nearby or just in someone's yard or on surface water, or if you notice it and it gets reported, the environmental consultants are then often brought in and retained to figure out the best course of action for investigation and remediation if required. Once we've got that under control and successful remediation has been completed, we can then collect confirmatory samples. If these samples are below the applicable standards, then we can backfill and reinstate the site and provide an environmental report for you. If the samples come back above the standards, we kind of have to backtrack and investigate a little bit more or dig out a little bit more before we can get that clean report. The right-hand side here shows an underground storage tank installed underground on the exterior of a house. You'll notice that there's a fill and vent pipe noticeable from the surface, so those are telltale signs. And then the oil tank you can see is leaking there, and it can flow through preferential pathways like utilities or the perimeter drain, as well as flow through the soil depending on the permeability of that soil and if the groundwater table is in that area, how high it is. The tank here is shown on the exterior of the building, but they're often found in the interior as well, either in a basement or underground under the house. So talked about the typical removal scenario. This is what that kind of looks like. Generally, we're looking at about $10,000 for the removal of the tank, the investigation around the tank, maybe 1 or 2 loads of soil being removed, some localized contamination, and then the confirmatory sampling and an environmental report. This kind of assumes that the site is easily accessible. We kind of have this hard packed clay underneath the sand tank nest to prevent contamination from expanding out, as well as there's no shallow groundwater that's going to spread the contamination across the site. The opposite of this would be the non-typical scenario. So this is when things can get a lot worse and a lot more expensive. This typically happens when you have a larger release, or the release happens in a soil type like a sandy soil or gravel fill underneath a house, where it can just spread out and move freely. This process can get even worse if you have shallow groundwater or preferential pathways that the oil can flow through easily. Can extend off-site. You can see there at the bottom we have a creek or any sort of nearby properties, or it can undermine the house as well in that structural fill. So this is unlikely, but this is just to show what a worst case kind of scenario would look like. I'm going to pass it over to Keith now, and he will explore insurance coverages and liability, some due diligence measures you can take, and evaluating your risk. So please take it away, Keith.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So to evaluate the insurance coverage, the short answer in the different situations is it depends. So in our experience, there's usually no insurance coverage when the contamination comes from an underground storage tank. It is always worth asking because there is some variance between policies, but generally if you're cleaning up contamination from an underground storage tank, I would not count on coverage for that situation. If contamination comes from an above ground tank spill, there's a better chance of coverage, although that can vary drastically between policies. Most modern insurance policies have an environmental exclusion clause that does not cover contamination cleanup. That said, there is usually a bit of coverage under a structural policy. In Paul's example there, if contamination migrates through perimeter drains, the insurance usually covers the cost to excavate and replace the perimeter drains, but not to dispose of the contaminated materials. And we've also seen policies that cover everything. So again, it really depends on your specific policy as to what would be covered. And then, so some common misconceptions here. We encounter these all the time, so hopefully I can debunk some of these myths. The first, that there are no permits at the municipality, so there would not be a tank. Again, as Paul mentioned at the start, many of these were installed and abandoned with no record or removed with no record. Granted, having no permits at the municipality supports that there's no tank, but definitely does not guarantee anything. Next, the tank was clean, so it should not pose a risk. Again, this reduces the chance that there's significant cleanup, but does not guarantee anything. We have removed many tanks in past that were cleaned and abandoned in place, but still had substantial contamination issues. Next up is the fire department said it was clean. The fire department, they're familiar with underground tanks, but at the same time are looking for things from a potential fire hazard perspective, not whether contamination is present at the site or not. So long story short of it, they're not environmental professionals and do not warrant anything regarding the condition of the site. This one we encounter a lot. I got a metal detection scan, so there is no tank. You can often get metal detection scans for free in the CRD, which provides some level of comfort, but they're definitely prone to errors and is not the best available technology at this time. We'll get into that a little bit later. Often when these tanks are cleaned, they cut the metal top off and fill it with sand, and it's rare to get these metal hits if the lid has been removed. Plus, they can be thrown off by other things in the ground. So we found many tanks that were already cleared by metal detection, so it's not a great way for finding tanks. And then finally, I have sold the property, so it's someone else's problem. And I'll cover this misconception in a bit more detail in these following slides here. So a bit of a disclaimer on liability. Of course, we're not lawyers, and we recommend that you seek legal counsel in different liability situations. But we wanted to provide an overview as to how liability is determined on contaminated sites. And basically it boils down to this polluter pay principle. And that is whoever is responsible for causing the contamination must also cover the cost of any site remediation as required. And so we'll explore this liability in a couple different case studies. So the first case study we have here, Paul, please, next slide. The first case study here outlines how liability can be allocated in heating oil tank situations. Again, these are not meant to incite fear, but we hope at the end of this that you are better able to assess the potential risks associated with tanks and know how to protect against these risks. That said, the first case study outlines a situation that involved a breach of contract. And basically what happened was a potential purchaser included an addendum to their purchase sales agreement stating that any UST be removed or remediated from the property prior to sale. The seller agreed. They had two scanning companies scan the property. They contacted the previous owner to see if they had any knowledge of a tank, and ultimately there was no evidence of a tank found. In other words, the sellers did as best due diligence as possible, and there was no evidence of a tank found. 4 years later, right when the sale went through and the new purchasers went to install a perimeter drain, they found a UST during the excavation that required about $50,000 in cleanup. They went back on that original contract and it said any UST, it did not have an expiration date, so ultimately the previous owners were found liable for that cleanup. Hopefully, yeah, this just gives you a bit more of a critical eye when presented or preparing these type of purchase contracts. And so the next case study we wanted to bring forth was a proportional liability case where several previous owners and the current homeowner were found liable for a cleanup. And basically the situation is the contamination was discovered in the gorge waterway and was traced back to a residence. The owner of that residence then retained an environmental consultant to investigate the source, and eventually it was determined that the contamination migrated onto her property from a neighbor's property, got into her perimeter drain, and discharged into the gorge. The owner of the neighboring property then could not afford the environmental costs, so they ended up seeking damages from the previous owners. The judge in the case ended up allocating proportional liability to all the previous owners. The oldest owner that could be tracked down owned the property between 1968 and 2002 and was deemed to have the most knowledge regarding the potential UST and was assigned the greatest portion of liability. Another owner purchased the property in 2012 for a fix and flip and ended up being found 35% liable, and the current owner was only found 15% liable. Notably, the former owners from 2002 to 2012 were not able to be tracked down, therefore could not be assigned any portion of the liability. So, to avoid getting caught in these undesirable situations, there are some best practices for identifying underground storage tanks. The first thing you can do is obviously check the municipal records just to see if they have anything on file. Again, they're not complete, so you got to take them with a grain of salt, but it's definitely a good starting point. And then if the home was built pre-1970, it is good practice to have a ground penetrating radar scan completed at the site. No scans are foolproof, but ground penetrating radar, or GPR, is currently the best available technology in the market to identify a tank. The image there just shows how it works. It sends radio waves into the ground, which then ping off an object, and you get an image of that object in the subsurface. Another thing you can do is have an environmental consultant, scanning company, or home inspector look for visual clues of a potential UST. And so this image above here just shows that fill pipe and vent pipe that Paul mentioned in the first graphic. And those are both telltale signs of a potential heating oil tank. So after we do our best to mitigate the risk by performing appropriate due diligence, it's still important to know what the potential risks are. Especially in today's hot real estate market, we get calls all the time from people asking, what the potential downside could be. I recently just performed an analysis for a prospective purchaser where we looked at the soil types in the area, the depth to groundwater, and other factors to better quantify the risk based on that specific situation to hopefully not lean towards those atypical situations. So we got this question enough that we decided to put this slide together that is based on our previous project information to help people with their own analysis. And basically about 50% of tanks are removed without any additional cleanup. So this costs about $5,000, which includes the removal, the sampling, the reporting costs, and everything you need to satisfy all the involved stakeholders. Although when the cleanup is required, about 25% of the time, the cleanup costs range between $5,000 and $10,000. About 50% of the cleanup costs range between $10,000 to $25,000. 10% fall in that $25,000 to $50,000 range, and another 10% fall in that $50,000 to $75,000. It's only about 5% of cleanups that are those worst case scenarios that generally cost more than $75,000. Heating oil spills, those can definitely be significant. It's hard to establish any sort of benchmarks on that, and they can definitely exceed the numbers outlined above, but so long as they're properly maintained and replaced as needed, they generally pose minimal risk. So a little bit on commercial underground tanks. They're often buried in ground much later than the residential USTs. This is basically due to the need for larger tanks to heat the building and limited space to put the larger tanks above ground. Also with the larger tanks comes more product, which results in greater potential for contamination. So any construction, pre-1990, when those natural gas started to come to the CRD, and even some after, they could have been using heating oil. That said, although the potential liability on commercial properties can be greater, most lenders require a stage 1 prior to lending on a property like this. And so these concerns are generally outlined in the report and can be negotiated between seller and purchaser. So with that, I will turn it back to Paul to identify some key points, and we're open to questions.
Thanks, Keith. So let's just go over some summary points here and some take-homes. For above ground tanks, ensure maintenance and replacement of heating oil as needed, or alternatively switch to natural gas. If a house had a furnace and was built pre-1970, there's a good chance that heating oil was used and potentially stored in an underground tank. It should be investigated further. Remove USTs as soon as practical. The longer you leave them in there, the more risk there is, and they're just best to get them out as soon as possible. If cleanup was completed, have the consultant explain the findings and any potential risks outstanding from the work. So this goes back to what Keith was saying in regards to fire department records, or maybe just some photos that were taken, or taking the owner's word for it, that there was no smell or contamination from the work. You want to see a consultant's report and make sure that it's done properly. Protect yourself as best as possible from future liability by requesting reliance on environmental reports and carefully reading any contracts related to USTs. Again, this relates back to those case studies. You want to be very careful in terms of the contract you're signing and the reliance that you're getting on environmental reports. Responsibility for the removal of the UST and remediation falls on the current property owner. That is true most of the time. But as Keith mentioned and went into some detail with, the past owners can be found liable to various extents. The seller is required to disclose if a UST is present in a property disclosure statement. This property disclosure statement forms part of a contract. So if you're unsure if a UST existed at the property before, we recommend not saying outright no that there was no UST, potentially that you don't know, or getting some scanning and work done to find out, because this becomes a potential contract and warranty in regards to the sale of the property, and you can be fined liable, as we talked about before. Buyers should perform adequate due diligence prior to purchasing a property. Keith walked through what that looks like and what due diligence methods you can use and what's best. Most modern insurance policies have an environmental damage exclusion. Again, Keith touched on what typically insurance companies cover. That changes with every policy, but typically they don't cover USTs and only part of spills from above ground tanks. Lenders generally insist potential UST issues be resolved before financing. Again, there's been increased interest in that in the 2010s and going forward. But lenders don't want to lend against a property that has an unknown tank, or used to be a tank with no analytical. So we want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have any follow-up questions or specific questions about a project, we'd be happy to help. This is mine and Keith's contact information on the screen. Yeah, have a great day, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, everybody.